So stage 2 is where you start to introduce grips. You use biosim to set up different modes and features. You're making it a little bit more advanced. And in stage 2, the first way that I would recommend, if you have a quantum especially, to teach a user how to get into grips would be with gesture control. So let's talk a little bit about what gesture control is. We'll run through some of those things, and then we'll have him simulate some of these tasks as well. So gesture control, what you're looking at here on the screen is a picture of the app. And the app shows a hand in the middle of the screen and then 4 little bubbles around it. And those bubbles represent what grip is going to be activated when the hand is moved in that direction. So we have, my eyesight's not great there, index point is for forward, and this will make more sense here once you see it. But by setting that up in the app with the bubble above it being index point, when the user moves forward, it'll activate the index point. If they move left, it'll activate lateral grip. If they move right, it'll be that thumb 3-jaw chuck or tripod closed, and then back is thumb precision pinch closed. Don't sweat what the grips are, but does that make sense, like how the app is set up to program those different grips? And there are 4 in there by default, and then the user or the prosthetist can change those to whatever grips they want. So let's have a look at how you activate gesture control. There are a few rules of engagement. The first is that the hand has to be parallel to the ground. Can't be up in the air, can't be down at the side. You really want an intentional position of, if it's a transradial, typically the elbow's at 90 to do that. After that, you want to maintain an open signal. I would just say sustain an open signal until you see this index finger twitch. So I'm going to sustain the open signal. Index finger's going to twitch. Let me try that again. Index finger's going to twitch. This time the index finger's going to twitch. Oh, I have an Ilum Ultra. Holy cow. I was showing you the friction wrist. It'll never do that. So we're opening until the index finger twitches. And once it does, we're going to move in one of those 4 different directions for the grip that we're after. Now, once you're in the grip, it's going to remain in that grip no matter what position you are in space. It's just activating the gesture control. You have to have the hand parallel to the ground. Does that make sense? And it was an intentional step that we went through because we didn't want users, I'll give you an example of, like, maybe you're reaching up into a cabinet and it's a new user, they're accidentally sustaining that open signal and they get into a grip right before they grab what they were after. Well, that's frustrating, right? We want it to be an intentional position and an intentional open before you can utilize the gesture control. Make sense? Gesture control?
This video tutorial.
And we're not going to watch this, but this is an example of a great resource that the things that you need to set up in the app are available on this training suite that we're working through. So we get a lot of people that call and want to ask more questions about gesture control, how do you activate it. It's fine to answer those questions, but if they want to share resources with a therapist or the end user, this is a great source of information such as these videos. And another thing I didn't mention, you can right mouse click on any of these videos and save them. It's not protected or anything, so you could incorporate them in your own presentations. You can wow the audience with these great videos and take complete credit for it. So that's gesture control. The other thing in stage 2 is app control. As it sounds, super easy. All you're doing is pushing a button to activate the grip that you want to in the hand. Now, this is a great way for users to get into a grip that maybe they don't use as often. You know, for instance, maybe I work at a computer all day, and I want index point to be one of my grips. Well, I wouldn't use the app to activate that, because that would require me using my phone or my iPod or something like that to activate it, right? I would use that I would make gesture control one of those grips, or that grip. But if you're like me, my wife hates this. I don't like to clean. I could see a dirty room and I just block it out. I don't know what it is. But I want to use 2-finger trigger to control a spray bottle. Well, I don't want that to be gesture control, because especially as much as I clean, I would never use it. But that time where it's on the honey-do list, I have to do that, I can use the app to activate one of those grips that I use less frequently. Does that make sense? So it's a great access to all the other grips. The other thing I was telling you, the Apple Watch also has a function on it where you can program 4 different grips and you can touch them. It'll put the hand into different grips. Kind of cool. The Today extension on your iPhone too, if you swipe down from the top of your phone, that's what the Today extension is called. Whoops. Okay. So that Today extension can have 4 different grips too that you can activate. It's kind of neat. Most people have, an iOS device or something with them, right? If you're in the Android world, we will try to convert you because iOS is where it's at. Another thing that the hands have is something called Speed Boost. I mentioned that the hands are 30% faster and stronger than the original version. We thought that would be great, but then users were like, whoa, 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 pump the brakes a little bit. Let's slow this down. You do have the ability within the software. At the end of the day or at the end of the workshop, we're going to get into BioSim, and I'll show you where to do this. But you can drag this slider over and slide it back to the previous speed, which might be helpful for a new user that needs just a little bit more control. Nathan did a great job, like with those cups. Great job just slowly closing the hand. But if a user might be struggling with that, this is a way that you can kind of compensate with the speed. And then a functional example. This is just some different tasks. Again, there's not real true functional ADL tasks that I would call it. These are just objects. But using the app to switch to the different grips so that they understand what the grips do, how they could use them functionally, and then maybe decide maybe I want to set that up for gesture control and use that more frequently during everyday life. And there's that flexion wrist you can see flexing it down. Again, typing, things like that, I probably wouldn't use app control, but it's a good example of how it can be utilized. And then at the bottom of stage 2, you can integrate these new tricks that they've learned into some functional activities. Now that you have grips that they can activate, you can use things like the mouse. You can do an overview like we've seen already this video, the practicing of getting in and out of those grips using gesture control, making sure they understand that, making sure that they're at 100%. Sometimes when they're a new user, and you'll see Nathan do this here in a second, but I was really impressed with his ability to activate gesture control without looking like he was having a seizure. Because some people, when it's new and they are trying to time everything and they see that index finger twitch and they're doing this, sometimes it's reacting differently. So you want to teach them to just subtly move, those kind of things, making sure they're becoming proficient, but also, I guess really it's back to that fluidity again. And then making them do different tasks that require changing grips throughout the task. And we talked about being a magician, but it is almost sleight of hand in that they're doing something with their sound side, and while they're working with their sound side, they're activating gesture control in the prosthesis so that they're ready for the next grip. So a lot of it's pre-positioning and thinking about the task in advance and what grips would be helpful to complete that task. So during this coffee making, he had switched from a tripod to a pinch and then a lateral pinch as well for that sugar packet, all to complete that task. And this was his first experience with gesture control, so you will see him kind of not so subtly move, a little herky-jerky there, and that's one of those things that gets better with time and with practice. Tying shoes is a big one. You'll meet a lot of people that if they haven't worn a prosthesis, they're wearing just slip-on shoes or something like that, but you can see how rapidly and proficiently he can tie a shoe because he's in a grip. He could certainly do that without being in that lateral pinch. We'll just watch that one more time and he has different colored socks on. I always find that fascinating in this video. But one thing you can hear is the vari-grip. That vari-grip is existing in the thumb because it's the one that's mobile. So he's vari-gripping on the string as he's using it, and you can see it's very fluid, and he's able to create a lot of force there to tie the shoe. And this wouldn't necessarily wouldn't require a grip, but now you're involving more bilateral tasks, so supporting something with the prosthesis, using the sound hand to perform the more dexterity, like tying up or zipping up the coat. In this video, I could take or leave. What she's going to do is she's going to use the hand, the prosthesis, to cut the apple, and then she's going to switch sides. It just shows that you can do it either way, but this by far would be what I would recommend. I guess with hand dominance, maybe that's awkward for somebody to cut with the opposite side, but I think you're going to get a lot more control and better results doing it that way. And then this is a more complex task. We're going to have him make us some spaghetti and meatballs. So he's got to use gesture control to get into different grips. And I think for the sake of time, we'll just, I'll spare you the details, but he's using gesture control to switch between grips as he's performing the tasks. Here he's opening the jar, get into more of that cylindrical grip. Who's hungry? This looks good. Yummy. And then he also goes on to make a salad, so using that gesture control as well. And again, this was his first experience with it, so he did okay. I think his motion is a little bit more than it needs to be. It's the same technology that's in the hand as is in your phone. When you take your phone and you orient it differently and the phone switches, it does the same. Now, there are some times where you take your phone and you're like, why did that not switch? But most of the time, it just takes subtle movement. And in the same way, the hand just needs a little bit of subtle cueing to know that it's moved, accelerated, and then stopped. Same technology. So another thing that I'll have people visualize as well if they're using gesture control for the first time and how much motion is required is I will have them put something in their hand that maybe like a cup or something like that. And I tell them that I want the water to kind of just, slosh but not splash everywhere. Like if I were to take the lid off of this, is water coming out? Or am I just doing that? Because that's all it takes, just a little bit of acceleration. So if you have somebody that's struggling with that, maybe that's a cueing thing that you can tell them. Okay, so that's stage 2. What we're going to do after this, what we're going to do next after this with Nathan is using the virtual limb. So I'm going to talk about the virtual limb, and then in one swoop, we're going to cover stage 2, and we're going to use the virtual limb to do some myotesting. So let's talk about that. So the virtue limb is this little gizmo that we use for myotesting and training. And the virtue limb is set up so that without any devices connect to it, you can still connect to our software and do myotesting with electrodes. But you can take that one step further and you can actually add a hand to it. It doesn't even have to be our hand, but you can add a hand that has a QWD connection on the top of it to actually have the user start to open and close. Now the reason this is helpful is for a new user, you can actually start with the stage 1 things before they ever get their first prosthesis. And if you remember that research article that I shared with you, early therapy nearly doubles the rate of daily use. So even if it's not with a prosthesis, if it's with the virtue limb and you can start that therapy early, you're going to have a better chance of acceptance and utilization. So you can incorporate a hand into the virtue limb. You can use it without that as well. And what you do is you connect this to the app and you can, of course, get the signal activity, but then you can also simulate, and hence the name, a virtual hand. So it's a virtue limb. So there's a virtual hand that you can control with these electrodes within the software, and there's also some training in games and things that you can do to increase the user's proficiency of open and close, strength, and separation. Have you guys seen the virtual limb or heard of it or know of it? Getting a few yeses? Okay. All right, let's myotest him. So we're going to use the same app, but we're going to connect to the virtue limb. I always get nervous at conferences with all these things that are around Bluetooth connections and whatnot. But we're connected to the Virtualim, and there's 3 options that you can see there. First one is analog gauges. I'll just give you a preview of these, and then we'll use them. Analog gauges, as it sounds, it's a gauge to show you the magnitude of the electrode signal. This is great for finding your sites initially, but then when you want to figure out if you can isolate the signals, then you'd move on to RealTime Graph. This demonstrates or illustrates the signals in red and blue lines, right? So you can see that he's not co-contracting. And then the last area of the software is the training in games, which includes a virtual hand, which we'll set up and have him use here real quick. So if you don't mind taking off your arm, we'll do some myotesting with you. And I'll just give you my approach to myotesting. Take it or leave it. It might be good, might not be. But the first thing I do is I start with my electrodes on about 5. The scale goes 1 to 7. 5 is a good range. Just so you know, as you turn this potentiometer, it starts off just amplifying the signal like this, but then as you get up above 6, it starts to exponentially go up. So you want to be careful. If you start off really high, you're going to get a lot of signal activity, but you're not going to get real clean and helpful signal activity. So I start with those on 5. And of course we can cheat because I can see right where your electrodes were, but I won't do that, I promise. But the first thing you want to do, any sensitivities, any area that I push that you're going to punch me with the right hand or anything?
We'll find out.
Ex-military, I'm asking. All right, this is great. And I just start feeling around the arm, and what I want you to do is kind of imagine kind of fanning your wrist back, fanning your wrist in. Yep. And if they're congenital, they've never experienced that, but they can usually wiggle or wobble, and you can kind of start to feel stuff. So what are my 2 sites? What am I looking for on the transradial level? Oh, yeah. You want antagonistic muscle groups, right? So there's the flexor wad that attaches here on the medial epicondyle. Everybody check out their myotester. You've all got one, right? And just kind of feel that motion or that muscle contraction, that bulge when you fan your wrist in or make a fist, and feel the difference between the 2. Just fanning your wrist makes a big difference compared to making a fist and pulling that down or making a fist. But you can feel there's going to be like a little area right there that is your sweet spot. And you're going to palpate first. You're going to find, go ahead and do that again, in. So yep. So for him, I can feel, yeah, more in here is where I'm palpating a signal, but that doesn't mean that's where the myocyte's going to be, but we can try. So my approach to myotesting goes as such. If you don't mind taking one step towards, there we go. Do that motion again, yeah. So I see your myocytes there, but I'm feeling a little bit more proximal. But here's my approach. I find that area where I felt the most contraction, and I put the electrode there. And now I want you with 50% effort, just imagine bringing your wrist down or fanning in to make a signal. Good. And I look at what kind of number I got. What was it, 25, something like that? All right. And then from there, what I do is I have them do a few different motions. So was that more, can you show me with your right hand what you were doing? Okay. Is that what you do? Okay. What if you do just making a fist? What does that look like? So not quite as much as 25, right? What about a fist and in? Oh, jackpot. Ding, ding, ding. We're at a casino. You'd be winning. That's good. The other thing you can do is you can add a little ulnar and radial deviation. Sometimes that helps as well. He's good and strong. We're not going to have a problem finding something, but sometimes that can make a huge difference on strength and even longevity of the muscle. But anyway, because I know that he does this for close, go ahead and do that again one more time for me. We're going to assume that that's what we found to be the most adequate motion and whatnot. From there, what I start doing is I start moving this in one direction at a time. So I'm going to start by moving it a little bit more, would that be superior, I guess? And then we're going to do the same amount of effort, same motion, and we're going to see if we gained strength or we lost strength. What do you think? Gain or loss? All right, so we're going to go up just a little bit more. And what I'm looking for is the end point where that starts to drop off. And that's going to tell me that that's sort of the border. Yeah. Are you looking at that?
Yeah.
Because that makes a difference too, yeah. Try to just give me the same amount of effort. Yeah, I don't think there's quite as much of a signal there. So I don't have a pen, but what I would do is I'd mark that superficial side of that. And I know that I don't want to have that electrode be any higher than that point. And that's good because his electrode site's actually lower, right? Then I go back to my starting position and I move just a little bit posterior. Same thing. Ooh, yeah. Same thing, 50% effort. Yep. You have to kind of ask that again because sometimes, especially if they're looking at that, there's an instinct within us that it's like, yeah, I'm going to peg it. But that's really strong, really good. I'm going to go a little more. Same thing, 50% effort. Still very strong. He is. Like a boss. All right, we've dropped off, so I'd make a little mark there. And now I've got a border for superior and posterior, right? And my strongest site should be in the middle of that, which amazingly is right where your electrode is. Now the next thing I would start doing, now that I know that that's my middle point, which should be the strongest, now I'm going to start moving distal. And then I'll do the same thing with proximal until that signal drops off. So there's one little inch more distal. Very good. Again. Maybe one more. Great. And then I'd move more proximal from where I started. So whoever myotested and fit you did a good job. That's kind of right where it ends up. But what you end up with is kind of a bullseye, right? Borders all around, and in the center should be your strong spot. Now that doesn't mean that that's the site I'm going to use, because what we could find is that could be the strongest site, but he can't relax it compared to the other side. Then you might have to shift it a little bit. Good point. Good point. Yeah, sometimes as you move proximal, you're like up in here, and it's a great site, but you're right at the proximal trim line. That's not going to work. So yeah, make sense? So then we would do that same thing with the open or the extensor. Again, I'm going to start by palpating. I want you to just bring your wrist back. Use your myotester, your other hand, and feel the difference between finger extension, wrist end fingers. Big difference, right? And they insert, that's the extensor wad. They're going to insert on the lateral epicondyle. So you're going to feel them kind of branch off that way as you do that. So we're going to cut forward in time. And the next thing I would do with the user is use compresso grip or wristband like this. And I'd put my electrodes where I found the good, strong sites, because you can influence the site as well, right? If you push a little harder or you shift or something like that. So I want to know how these are going to behave in a prosthesis. All right, go ahead and do the close for me, the down, good, and back. And one thing I did miss is I typically will moisten the skin a little bit. You know, if you just have like a little cup of water and a paper towel, because that's what's going to happen in the prosthesis eventually. All right, we got something weird going on. If they're a very hairy individual, sometimes you can trim that hair or just kind of get it out of the way. Like I got a good bit there. That's going to insulate it. What are some other things that will interfere with electrode conductivity? Scar tissue, yes. Adipose tissue. Not much you can do about that one. And the big one, though, is lotion. A lot of people put on like these lotions and things like that. Just some rubbing alcohol, just get that off to make sure you're dealing with some nice clean skin before you start. Sorry. All right, try again. That's in?
That's out.
Okay, and then what's in look like? All right, in. Out. So I just changed the wrong one, sorry. I missed. All right, in. Out. Yeah, I gotta turn that one down now. So it's a little bit of a balancing act. You want the signal to be strong, but not pegging it out each time as they make the signal. There it again for me.
So in.
In, Good. Once you're happy with the sites that you've selected, then it's a good time to switch over to the real-time graph. Show me the in again. Yep. And there's a little bit of co-contraction there, but it could just be where I have it in space too. But the real-time graph is going to show us how well he can isolate those signals. So let's do your close, which is kind of wrist down, fingers down. Yep. Show me what you did before too. Add your fist to it. Yeah, I guess about the same. Do it again. Good. And then wrist back. Good. All right, so notice with the open, he's hitting a ceiling. We don't want that. We want it to be kind of like the blue a little bit. So what I would typically do then is turn down that electrode so that I got a signal. Well, I guess I could ask, how much effort were you giving in both directions? A lot, a little?
About probably 75.
Okay, show me 50% both directions. So 50%, that's 50% back. That looks really good. So I would just turn his close up a little bit. Right now I'm just below 5, so I've got room. And my fingers have these built-in potentiometer adjusters, so it's perfect. All right, try that again. 50% in. Yep, and then 50% out. This opens still a little strong, but it'll work for now. All right, so that's our open and close, right? We're happy with the way he's separating the signal. You can always go back in time. You see that little bit of red that he's getting when he did the blue there? It's not a problem. It's one of them has to be stronger, and as long as one is substantially stronger, which it is, the hand's not going to care. So the last thing we're going to do is go over to training and games, and we're going to select virtual hand. And that's a right and you're a left, so let's switch that. And when we hit start, now you have the ability to control this hand, so if you do wrist down, you can close it. You're getting a little bit of an open there signal. I don't think that's him. There might be something just the way I placed it. But you can spin this hand in space. Go ahead and do it again. Yep, so you can see it from many different angles. You can just keep it spinning too. But it's a great virtual representation of what the hand looks like and how it's responding to his signals. And then if they progressed and mastered that, that's when you could add a hand. Now this is going to drop the connection because I'm going to go to the hand now here. All right, you should have control of that now. Yep. And now you could start stage 1 before he ever gets the prosthesis. Teach him how to rotate the thumb, stall fingers, proportional control. That was really good. You know, you could place a delicate object in there and have them slowly contract and grab it. Make sense? I'll mention during the break, somebody was asking about reimbursement and ways to justify the use of this technology. And what I have on the screen is actually the Touch Bionics website. And I wanted to show you something that we use very frequently with clients in kind of determining what goals they have, setting expectations, and also seeing how the technology could help them. And when you go to our website, the main page that you see is what's displayed here. And in the upper right-hand corner, there's a little login/register in the upper right. I'll zoom in there to give you a picture of it. And I'm going to click on that login/register. Hopefully the Wi-Fi works here. And it allows you to create an account, and there's 2 reasons you might want to create an account. The first is for BioSim. To use the software, you have to identify yourself as an end user or a practitioner. So when you sign up here, that's how you determine that. That's how you would log into the app. The other thing it allows you to do is to complete what we call a patient care pathway. And the patient care pathway is what we use to make a template for insurance authorization and justification. So if we're in your what we call a portal, you can, on the right-hand side, you can add a new patient or client. And we won't do all of this, but you add their information and their email, and it sends them an email to complete this. Really, it's kind of like a survey, But within that survey, it includes the Trinity Amputation Prosthetic Experience Scale, the tapes, and the DASH, the Disability of Arm, Shoulder, and Hand. And when they're done completing the patient care pathway or that survey, the practitioner, you get the results of that, and you also get a template. Because part of the questions that are asked are involving what their goals are and their current assessment of where they stand with the DASH and the tapes, right? So that is what we typically use for that insurance submission. It's a great resource. It's free to use, free to sign up. And like I said, once you complete it, it gives you that template that then you can modify if you want to, kind of jazz it up a little bit, but the core information that you need for that reimbursement's in there. Cool? All right, so we talked about the full hand this first half. Now we're going to talk about partial hand solution, and that's eye digits. So the second option on the training suite is called eye digits. And the first thing is eye digits is plural, so I think it should be what are eye digits, but it says what is eye digits. But either way, what are they? Eye digits are myoelectric prosthesis for partial hand limb loss. It's based off the same technology that's available in the full hand. So we have digits that can stall, we have a thumb that can rotate, we have all the options of activating grips with gesture control and that sort of thing with a partial hand solution. I'll pass this one around. This is intended for somebody that's missing all 5 fingers, but you can do this for as few as 1 digit that's missing to as many as 5. We really want the client's main goal to be function over aesthetics, primarily because these are all custom made and the shape is all custom. We don't have a full covering option like we do in our full hand, especially with skin tones and things like that. We used to try to cover them with a custom made silicone covering, and if you can't sleep tonight and you want to do some Googling, the uncanny valley is a theory in robotics that says if something looks like human form but doesn't move or get it just right, it reminds us of death. And what we found is when we were covering these digit systems with skin coverings that looked very much like skin, it was aggravating people's post-traumatic stress because it looked like the hand was injured or deformed. And it also was drawing more attention to it because our human psyche, when we see something that's close but just not quite right, we're drawn more to it. Whereas if something looks very bionic and robotic, we understand what it is and we accept it, and it doesn't fall into that uncanny valley. So covering options, that's why we emphasize that we really want to focus on function, not aesthetics with the eye digits. Just like I said, we have the capabilities in the full hand are available in eye digits. You get that compliant grip. You have a manually rotatable thumb, 32 different grip features. We do have 2 different versions of eye digits as well. We have an eye digits access, which is more of a base model. Digits don't run at that 30% faster speed, a few less grips available. And then we have eye digits quantum, which has all the latest, greatest technology like Nathan showed you in the full hand. The eye digits, that system that's going around, what you'll notice is there's a piece that is flexible that sits up on the forearm, and that's where we house the componentry and the batteries. Because we don't have a lot of space like we do with a transradial system or transhumeral, we need to hide that componentry somewhere else, so we put it in a wristband and put that up on the forearm. And that's a great way to move the space and move the componentry and save space. And then the 4 different ways to get into grips, just like you saw in the morning session, we have 4 different ways there, including gesture control, muscle control, the app, and the grip chips. So that is a video, just an overview video like we saw with Claudia, but since we've seen the Claudia one, we're going to move on to just presentation and who's a good candidate. For eye digits, we really want the loss of the finger to be at the MCP level or more proximal. And the reason for that is the eye digit system is a full finger replacement. So if the individual has a proximal phalanx and you add a full finger past that, now you're going to have incongruency with joint centers, and just length of the finger is going to look strange, somewhat odd. So we really want MCP level or more proximal for which fingers you're missing. It's appropriate, more appropriate after adolescence, just because there's a lot of growth. Kids are a lot more active and playing in the mud and doing monkey bars and things like that, that would make it not an appropriate product for that age level. And again, we want to emphasize that it's not a cosmetic solution. The other thing we use for candidacy is this American Medical Association. They have these guidelines for impairment. And what you see on this slide is a hand and then an associated percentage impairment with which digit you lose. As you might imagine, your thumb is going to account for most of your hand function because it's your pinch patterns all rely on your thumb. And then your pinky finger on the other side is less function. Now, if you know anything about the pinky, it contributes a lot to force. 50% of your grip force is driven from that. But function-wise, not so much. So if you're looking at the MCP level, what we see is that the thumb accounts for 40% of your hand function, index is 20%, middle finger is 20%, ring is 10%, and little is 10%. And what you take from that is that if somebody comes into your office and they're missing just their pinky finger, it's going to be very hard to warrant a digit system when they should have 90% of their hand function still remaining. Whereas if they present with their thumb missing, that's nearly half of their hand function remaining, and that would be a good digit candidate for that one digit missing. Does that make sense? Am I explaining that well? In my sleep-deprived state? Okay. Some appropriate presentations. We have the one on the left here. You can see well proximal to the MCP joint, loss, all 5 fingers missing. The one on the right is a thumb only, thumb remaining, right? Those 4 digits are missing, also a great candidate. The one on the left here is an IED blast in Afghanistan, lost his thumb, and he was actually a transhumeral amputee on the contralateral side. So not only was he missing 40% of his hand function on the left, but on his right side he was a transhumeral amputee as well. And then the one on the right, he has his thumb and index, so you're like, well, you just said that the ulnar fingers don't contribute as much to function, and that is true. But when you add up those percentage totals, you can add those together for a percentage that's a little bit higher, and he had some nerve damage, so he had some decreased strength and range of motion in the remnant fingers, so that also contributes to function and candidacy. Are there comorbidities? Are there other things going on in that sound hand, or the remnant digits? Suitable candidates for digits, we want them to be motivated to use the prosthesis, have realistic expectations. This might sound like a repeat because it's the same thing we said for the full hand. We want to make sure they understand what the device can and can't do. And then as the therapist gets involved, we found that functional training nearly doubles their functional ability compared to people that just sort of figure it out on their own. So if you've ever had a high-tech device, maybe it's your phone, maybe it's a computer, if you've taken a class or gotten formal education, you're going to be much more proficient. So these 2 research articles from Durrance and O'Shea and Chris Lake in 1997 both supported the fact that nearly doubling their functional ability when you have that functional training. So it's a crazy high percentage, I think. So managing expectations, I think it's good to show pictures, make sure they understand what the device looks like. Are they talking a lot about cosmesis and what the finished cover will look like? Are they worried about that? If that's so, then maybe iDigits wouldn't be appropriate. But want to make sure that their expectations are in line with what it can do. Early on, it might feel heavy, might feel a little tight because you're compressing skin and the hand, which is much more mobile. And I think a big one is sensory feedback. You're putting a prosthesis on somebody, and that one we passed around does have an opening on the palm, but you're covering up a lot of the sensory feedback that they can receive from their hand. So that has to be considered as well. Componentry that we use, we almost always go with rolled silicone componentry for the inner socket. I'm going to be doing a presentation on Friday for how we make these. So if you're interested in seeing how that's made, it's more for technicians, but that inner rolled silicone is really appropriate for the partial hand limb loss because of all the motion that you have in your hand. Normal thermoplastics or rigid materials would be less appropriate compared to this. It also allows us to incorporate things like zippers, openings that would be closed with a strap to hold it in place. So I'll pass these around. The other thing you'll feel is we can change the durometer, the shore hardness of the silicone. in these designs, which makes a big difference on it as well. And the way we control these is we use these low-profile remote electrodes. You'll see that there are 2 over each location of control. We're using intrinsic sites, and I'll talk about that in a second. And then you use 1 ground location somewhere on the hand. The way they're held in place is with a suspension piece. That one that I'm passing around has those suspension pieces incorporated into it that hold the electrode in place. Here's what the electrodes look like. I think they look like a little gold M&M almost. They're very low profile, so we call them LP, remote electrodes, because we don't have the same height that we would normally have with a remote electrode in a transradial system. We want to keep everything as low profile as possible. Another option is force sensing resistors, or FSRs. FSRs are an option. I'm not a big fan of them just because you'll have trouble controlling the prosthesis with different positions. So for example, let's say you want to use an FSR because the person has a remnant little finger. And you want to put an FSR on the palmar side and the dorsal side, which isn't a bad option. So every time they push against the palmar side, the digits would close. They push against the dorsal side, the digits would open. It's a good approach. However, when you go to pick something up, you're going to weight that system. And it's very hard to unweight that FSR and inadvertently avoid putting pressure on it and closing it. So to open up, you'd have to unweight the system. And because we live on Earth and we have gravity to contend with, you have to take that into consideration. And FSRs, for that reason, can be very problematic depending on what position the hand is in, what forces are applied to the prosthesis. And the other thing is longevity. I find that FSRs, they need to be on a very flat surface. And there's very few spots on our hand that is flat. You know, it's a big sphere. So you have to build a flat surface in there and make sure that, you know, they're not being bent or curved, or they make them delaminate. And then the digit sizes, we have different lengths, and that's what the digit sizes are referring to. There are 2 different size kits that you can order, an extra small and a medium, and the sizes have to do with the length of the fingers and the spacing between them. The thumb's only available in one size, but comes with that rotation piece that you see on the one that I'm passing around. It's controlled with friction, so there's a nut that you tighten down to control that friction or increase that friction on the thumb. And that allows you to achieve those human pinch patterns of tripod, precision pinch, and lateral pinch. Not to get too into this, but the way the parts are put together is the digit itself sits on a knuckle assembly, which sits on a mounting plate, and here you see the 2 different sizes. The extra small, the fingers are all parallel to one another. We get them as close as possible. So for that extra small hand or that smaller presentation. The medium, we splay the fingers ever so slightly. So as the fingers extend, they abduct as well. And as they flex, they adduct. So it's a little more anatomical, but we've got some more spacing, and sometimes that's not appropriate for certain hand sizes. And then the Bellows PCB is where all the connections are made. It's the hub. It's the piece that's connecting that wristband to the prosthesis. It has that little ribbed silicone piece that protects those connections. And there you see the wristband all assembled. 2 batteries are used on either side of that wristband to power the system. And then all your connections run through that bellows to the prosthesis, to the digits. This is the charger. I have one up here. When you order a digit system, you get 4 batteries, 2 to charge, 2 to use. The charger has some lights on it that indicate the charging status. And usually 1.5 to 2 hours, you should be able to fully charge these batteries. And then I always get the question, well, how long do the batteries last? Well, it's kind of like the tires on your car. It depends on how much you drive, right? So in the similar manner with digits, it really depends on how much they're using it and how many digits you're replacing. You know, if you're doing a 1-digit system of just a thumb, that's going to get a lot more battery life out of the system versus somebody that has a 5-digit system. But in general, I see people getting 6 to 8 hours of use out of those 2 batteries before they need to switch to the second set. And here you see a completed system. You've got the socket, the frame, the digits, the wristband, and everything put together. some suspension options. Because you're dealing with typically a bulbous distal end, donning and doffing can be tricky. So we have to use some creative methods to get in and out, and one of them is incorporating a zipper into the silicone. So that one I passed around, you'll see there's a zipper incorporated into the silicone. Makes it a lot easier to get in and out of that. And without it, it'd be very difficult to be able to don that and doff the socket. Another option, though, is a suspension strap or a ratchet strap, and that's that lower picture that you see. That's actually like a ski buckle that you can crank down on that to tighten that force around at the base of the thumb a little bit more to get more force and suspension. So it's another option as well. And then you can also change your trim lines. Whenever possible, we want to try not to cross the wrist. So most of the ones you see that are being passed around either terminate at the wrist or just proximal to it. And that's going to allow the most range of motion out of the wrist, right? But it is silicone. So if we do need to cross the wrist, there are times where you have to do that. And what I use as a rule is if you were to take and put on the limb a Livestrong bracelet or an Apple Watch or something like that, and they were to swing their arm at their side, would that come off? Would it fall off both sides? Maybe just the owner side, maybe just the radial side? If it would stay put and you wouldn't lose that bracelet or that watch, you probably can terminate the silicone right at the wrist. If, however, you see it migrate off one side, or would see it migrate off one side, you're probably going to have to bring that trim line up above the owner styloid to maintain suspension. There are times where you can't find intrinsic muscle sites, and we'll talk about where we look for muscle sites, but if you can't find intrinsics, then you're going to have to bring that silicone all the way up the forearm to encapsulate those electrodes. So those are the 3 different trim line lengths that we typically see illustrated in those pictures. And really it goes with suspension and electrode location. The first step in creating one of these devices is to get an impression of the residual limb. And we use impression silicone for that. It's a room temperature vulcanizing RTV silicone. So it's poured on. We allow it to cure, and then we take it off and fill that with plaster and begin the fabrication process. The steps are to apply Vaseline to the hand and arm. That's a release agent, especially if they have a lot of hair. You want to make sure that you coat that really well so that the silicone can be removed from it. They'll thank you for it. You're going to mix the catalyst, which is in a little vial. You're going to mix that into the silicone tub. Mix that up really good. You get about 2 to 3 minutes of cure time, and then you begin pouring it over their residual limb. As it falls off the limb and falls to the table underneath, you're going to scoop that silicone back up and reapply it to their limb. Once it's cured, as you can see here, you can kind of have them return to a relaxed position, and for most of us, a good relaxed position is just our arms at our side. Once it's cured, then you're going to remove it. And the only thing we ask is if you are taking this off, don't cut the mold. We want to have it a tear in it so that it can key itself back up as we put it back together. Whereas if you cut it, it's very hard to get it to line up perfectly. And then we get the impressions sent to us, and we will fill those with plaster and begin the fabrication process. So this is actually me taking an impression of somebody. So this individual, you can see his left hand is affected. He has his index and thumb. First thing I'm going to do is take Vaseline, apply that to his arm. And you don't want this real thick. You just want to make the skin kind of shiny so that you know that you can get the silicone back off. And you try to work the hair, the width the way it wants to lay. So running it down the arm. You don't want to spike it up and get it into the silicone. That would be really painful. And then I want to find his relaxed position. And like I said, for most people, that's returning their hand to their side. I'm looking at his thumb and index, making sure that's in a good position. Sometimes muscle imbalances, it's not the best position, so you have to cue them. Once I'm happy with that position, then I'm going to grab my tub of silicone. I'm going to open the vial of the catalyst. And I use 2 tongue depressors, and you'll see why here in a second. But I mix that vial in with the silicone, and I try to mix it for a good 10 to 20 seconds, making sure that I get all the silicone off the bottom, off the sides, make sure it's really thoroughly mixed. Because any catalyst that doesn't come in contact with the silicone just won't cure, and it'll be messy. Once I've got it mixed, then I start pouring it over their limb. Emptying the container out, and here's where these 2 tongue depressors are helpful. I just have some butcher paper on the table underneath them there. But I take those 2 tongue depressors, put them on the table, push the silicone together, scoop it up, and then spread them apart over top of the limb to kind of spread it out and reapply it. So I don't know if it reminds you of pancakes or icing on a cupcake or what, but you're just reapplying that until you cover everywhere. Now, thin spots are okay, but you don't want to have holes in the silicone. You want complete coverage of the skin. The reason you don't use alginate, you could. The one problem is you have to fill it then with like a dental stone or some sort of positive because it'll shrink, right? So what happens is then we would have to duplicate that positive model and then refill it with the appropriate plaster, especially for shipping. Silicone doesn't lose its shape, so we can ship that very lightweight. And really the main reason I've found is that it's really hard to see what position they're in with alginate. You know, if they're in a bucket or, you know, are you relaxed? Oh yeah, I'm relaxed. And then you take it out in their hands like that, you know. Whereas this, you can see what position, and you can see his index finger, you know, he's kind of in an odd position, but I can cue him once I get him in that desired position.
What's the waiting time before a cue?
They say 2 to 3 minutes. Most often, you can get 2 to 3 minutes. If it's the first time you're doing one of these, I would say add less catalyst so you get a little more work time, because it does happen quickly. And then once I've got everywhere covered, I'm going to start getting him in a functional position so that as it cures, his hand is in the right position. So I return him back to that starting spot, wiggle his arm, make sure everything's where I want it to be. Make sure he's nice and relaxed. Once it's cured, kind of pinch the silicone away from the skin. And then it's really just sort of tug of war. I don't care if I tear it, so I can rip the proximal section to make it a little bit easier to get it off. That's what I'm doing here. And then I'm slowly kind of pulling on the silicone as he wiggles his fingers and introduces air so that he can remove it. And then you want to look down inside. It's like you and me. It's not what's on the outside that counts. You look down inside to make sure that you don't have any big bubbles or any gapping or anything like that. And that's it. That's the negative model that starts the whole iDigit process. All right, let's talk about site selection. How are you going to control a digit system? We want to use intrinsic sites whenever possible, and that's because we don't want muscles that are affected by what the wrist is doing, right? If you use forearm flexors and extensors, every time they move the wrist, you're going to activate the digits, which would be not good. So the 3 sites that you can look for are illustrated here, and we're going to do these with our little myotester. So take your myotester finger, and the first one we're going to look at is the thenar eminence, and you're going to look at the thumb. This thenar eminence location fans out, so it can be sometimes just adduction or it can be opposition, but most people you can feel good muscle contraction in that thumb, right, as you bring it across. Now you can't do this, you can't use this site if they have their thumb, because just like before, every time they move their thumb, they'd be moving the digits. But if there's no thumb present, it's a great muscle site location. Another location is the hypothenar. Hypothenar has two muscles that you can use. One is the abductor digiti minimi. So as you abduct the pinky finger, you should feel a little bit of a muscle contraction on the hypothenar, on the ulnar side. Great muscle location. Even with very proximal amputation levels, you're typically still able to find that muscle, which is great. The other one is the flexor digiti minimi. So it's on the palmar side, and that, for the user, they imagine just flexing their pinky down. Everybody getting a good signal on their hand? Good. And then the last place you can look on the hand is on the dorsum of the hand. We can do the dorso-interossei. And what we have there are 4 dorso-interossei. We have the first dorso-interossei, which sits right here on the side of the second metacarpal. When you move your index finger towards your thumb, you'll feel it contract. It's quite strong. Second dorso-interossei is between the middle finger metacarpal and the index. And for most people, if they kind of adduct those two, you can feel it contract. Just a very small muscle in there, but it's enough to pick up a signal. Moving on to the third dorso-interossei, that's the ring and middle finger. And then the fourth is the pinky and the ring. So you have all 4 of those, but that doesn't mean that all 4 are going to work, because you might have an abductor digiti minimi. It probably would be very difficult to use the 4th dorso-interossei because they're so close. But you want to find two sites whenever possible using those intrinsic muscles. Any questions about those? With the remote electrodes, you have to locate a ground electrode somewhere, and typically that's on the dorsum of the hand. That's just a common ground location where you're going to put that. Some considerations when you're looking for control sites: make sure that they maintain electrode contact throughout range of motion. If your site is too far distal on the hand and they go to flex their wrist, there's a chance you could lose contact, which wouldn't be good, of course. You don't want the electrode locations to be too close to the socket trim lines, and you also want to make sure that you try to keep it intuitive. It's not like transradial, like we talked about before the break, where it's flexors and extensors. You don't really have antagonistic groups that you can use. But if, whenever possible, abductor of the pinky, to me, seems like it would be an open, right? So that's intuitive, open. And then maybe the second dorso-interossei is your close. So that's what I mean about being intuitive, trying to keep it so that that motion sort of goes along with what the digits should be doing, open and close. Other thing you want to make sure is, can they independently move the wrist independent of those muscle sites? Any remnant fingers, can they move independent of the muscle sites? And then just like we did with Nathan, we want to make sure that they can control the system in all planes of motion, especially pronation and supination. So if you supinate your hand for me, what you'll notice is the pinky finger typically helps with that supination, and you're accidentally firing the muscle site on the palmar side of your pinky.